The cruelest words aren't always spoken by strangers. Sometimes they come from the people who should love you most. At 70 years old, Margaret Chen sat in her daughter's pristine living room, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, as the word stupid echoed in her mind, a word her own children had just used to describe her. But what happened next would transform not just her life, but challenge everything her family believed about age, intelligence, and the human capacity for reinvention. Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the extraordinary stories of ordinary people who refuse to let age define their limits. I'm so grateful you've joined us today. And if these stories of resilience and transformation resonate with you, please consider subscribing. It helps us share more inspiring journeys like Margaret's with the world. Margaret's story isn't just about learning languages. It's about the moment when a mother's broken heart became the fuel for one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements you've ever heard. It's about proving that the sunset years of life can actually be the sunrise of something entirely new. Her journey will challenge every assumption you have about aging, about family, and about what it means to truly live. Margaret Chen had lived 70 years believing she knew her place in the world. Born to Chinese immigrants who valued hard work over education, she had spent her youth caring for younger siblings while her brothers attended school. At 18, she married Robert, a kind man who promised her stability. For 52 years, she had poured herself into being a wife and mother, speaking broken English peppered with Mandarin phrases, always feeling like an outsider in her adopted country. Her children, David, 38, a successful lawyer, and Linda, 35, a marketing executive, had grown up embarrassed by their mother's accent, her simple ways, her inability to help with homework beyond elementary school. They loved her in their own way, but love and respect, Margaret had learned, were not always the same thing. The devastating moment came on a Tuesday evening in October. Margaret had been living with Linda's family for 3 months since Robert's funeral, trying to find her footing in a world that suddenly felt impossibly vast without her husband's steady presence. The autumn rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers as Margaret sat at the dinner table with Linda, her son-in-law James, and their 2 teenage children. The conversation had turned to college applications, something about essays and interviews that Margaret couldn't quite follow. She had tried to contribute, sharing a story about her own father's journey to America, but her words came out jumbled, a mixture of English and Mandarin that painted confusion across the faces around her. "Mom, just stop," Linda had said, her voice sharp with frustration. "You're confusing the kids." James, perhaps trying to lighten the mood, had chuckled. "Don't worry about Grandma. She's just not, built for these kinds of conversations." But it was her grandson, 16-year-old Michael, who delivered the crushing blow. "Why does Grandma even try to talk about school stuff? She doesn't understand anything. It's kind of embarrassing." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as Linda nodded slowly. "Michael's right, Mom. Maybe it's better if you just listen during these discussions. You've never really understood academic things anyway." David, who had arrived just in time to hear the exchange, placed a hand on his mother's shoulder, a gesture that felt more patronizing than comforting. "Mom, there's nothing wrong with being simple. You raised us, you kept house, you did what you were supposed to do. Not everyone needs to be intellectual." The word hit her like a physical blow. Simple, as if her entire existence could be reduced to such a diminutive term. As if the poems she used to write in secret, the books she devoured when no one was watching, the deep thoughts that kept her awake at night, meant nothing. "I understand more than you think," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Mom?" Linda sighed, the sound heavy with decades of condescension. "You dropped out of school at 14. You've never read a real book. You can barely speak English properly after 50 years in this country. There's no shame in accepting what you are. What you are. The phrase lodged itself in Margaret's chest like a splinter, sharp and festering. She excused herself and retreated to the guest room, a space that had never felt less like home. That night, she stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing not a woman of experience and wisdom, but exactly what her children saw: someone diminished, irrelevant, intellectually barren. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of quiet meals and careful silence. Margaret moved through Linda's house like a ghost, afraid to express opinions, afraid to ask questions, afraid to take up space. She began to notice how conversation stopped when she entered a room, how her children spoke in a different tone when addressing her. Slower, simpler, as if she were a child. But late at night, when the house settled into sleep, something else stirred within Margaret. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was young, a burning curiosity that refused to be extinguished. She would lie awake remembering the books she used to borrow from the library as a teenager, the poetry that once flowed from her pen like water from a spring. Where had that person gone? When had she allowed herself to become small? The catalyst came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after that humiliating dinner, Margaret was walking through the local park, a routine she had adopted to escape the suffocating atmosphere of Linda's house. The autumn air was crisp, painted with the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. She paused at a bench near the duck pond, watching an elderly man feed breadcrumbs to a small congregation of mallards. He was speaking to them in what sounded like French, his voice warm with affection. When he noticed Margaret listening, he smiled. "Bonjour, madame. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret nodded, unsure how to respond. The man switched to English, his accent melodious. "I'm Henri. I was just telling these ducks about my granddaughter's upcoming wedding in Paris. They're excellent listeners, though their French is still rather poor." Despite her melancholy, Margaret found herself smiling. "That's wonderful. About the wedding, I mean. You must be excited." "Oh, immensely. It will be my first time back to France in 20 years. My wife and I moved here when we were young, but after she passed." Henri's eyes grew distant. "Well, I suppose I lost myself for a while." Something in his tone resonated with Margaret's own grief. "How did you find yourself again?" Henri's laugh was gentle. "Languages, believe it or not. After Marie died, I felt so lost, so disconnected from everything that had meaning. So I decided to reconnect with my roots. I started relearning proper French. I had let it get rusty over the years. Then I learned Italian because Marie had always wanted to visit Rome, then Spanish, Portuguese. Each new language was like opening a door to a different version of myself. Margaret felt a strange stirring in her chest. "How many do you speak now?" 7 fluently, and I'm working on my 8th, Mandarin actually. It's quite challenging at my age. Henri studied Margaret's face with kind eyes. "You look like someone who understands the feeling of being lost." "I'm 70, Margaret said quietly. "My children think I'm simple." Henri's expression grew serious. "Age is just a number, my dear. The brain doesn't retire unless we force it to. Some of the most brilliant linguists I know didn't start learning until they were well past 60. There's something beautiful about learning languages in our later years. We have perspective, patience, and most importantly, we're no longer learning to impress others. We're learning for ourselves." As Margaret walked home that evening, Henri's words echoed in her mind. Learning for ourselves. When was the last time she had done anything purely for herself? When was the last time she had challenged her own mind, pushed beyond the boundaries others had set for her? That night, she found herself at Linda's computer, searching for information about language learning for seniors. What she discovered ignited something she thought had died years ago. Story after story of elderly people mastering new languages, of grandmothers earning university degrees, of minds that bloomed in their 7th and 8th decades of life. One article particularly caught her attention: the polyglot grandmother who learned 12 languages after retirement. The woman in the photograph was older than Margaret, her eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. In the interview, she spoke about how each new language had revealed new aspects of her personality, new ways of thinking about the world. "My family thought I was crazy," the woman had said. "But learning languages at this age isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about proving to yourself that your story isn't over." Margaret stared at that phrase until her eyes burned. Your story isn't over. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of the person she used to be: curious, hungry for knowledge, unafraid of challenges. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She walked to the local library, a building she had passed hundreds of times but rarely entered. The young librarian, Sarah, greeted her with genuine warmth. "I'd like to learn about languages," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "How to study them, I mean." Sarah's face lit up. "That's wonderful. Are you thinking of traveling somewhere specific?" Margaret paused, considering the question. Was she doing this for travel, for her family, or for something deeper? "I want to prove that I'm not simple," she said finally, the honesty surprising even herself. Sarah's expression grew tender. "You know what? Some of our best language learners are older adults. They bring such dedication and perspective to their studies. Let me show you what we have." For the next hour, Sarah introduced Margaret to a world she had never imagined. Language learning apps, online courses, conversation groups, books with accompanying audio. Margaret's hand shook slightly as she checked out her first stack of materials: a beginner's Spanish course, a French pronunciation guide, and a book titled The Senior's Guide to Mastering Foreign Languages. "Start with one," Sarah advised. "Really focus on it for a few months before adding another. And don't be discouraged by the initial difficulty. Language learning is like physical exercise. It gets easier with practice." Margaret chose Spanish, drawn by its musicality and the knowledge that it was widely spoken in their area. That afternoon, while Linda was at work and the house was quiet, she opened her first textbook with trembling hands. "Hola, me llamo Margaret." The words felt foreign on her tongue, awkward and uncertain, but there was something thrilling about them too, a sense that she was stepping into unknown territory, claiming space in a world that had always seemed beyond her reach. The first weeks were brutal. Margaret's throat ached from unfamiliar sounds, her head spun with verb conjugations, and she often found herself in tears of frustration. When Linda discovered her studying one evening, the reaction was predictably dismissive. "Mom, what is this?" Linda picked up the Spanish workbook, flipping through pages covered in Margaret's careful handwriting. "I'm learning Spanish," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. Linda's laugh was sharp. "Mom, you can barely speak English properly. Don't you think you're a little old to be playing student? Henri says age is just a number." "Henri? Who's Henri?" "A friend from the park. He speaks 7 languages." Linda's expression shifted to concern. "Mom, please tell me you're not falling for some scam artist. Old people who brag about speaking multiple languages are usually just confused or lying." The dismissal stung, but this time, Margaret felt something different alongside the pain, a spark of defiance. "I'm going to prove you wrong," she said quietly. "Mom," Linda's voice softened with pity, "I know Dad's death has been hard on you. Maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor. This language thing, it's not healthy." But Margaret had already turned back to her textbook, shutting out her daughter's words. That night she made a promise to herself. She would learn not just Spanish, but language after language, until no one could ever call her simple again. The next 18 months tested every ounce of Margaret's determination. Learning Spanish in her 70s was like trying to rewire her brain while it was still running. Simple concepts that children grasped intuitively required hours of practice. Her memory, once sharp, seemed to betray her at crucial moments. She would master a verb tense one day only to forget it completely the next. But Margaret had something many younger learners lacked: time and absolute commitment. She rose at 5 every morning, spending 2 hours with her books before the household awakened. She listened to Spanish podcasts while cooking, repeated phrases while walking, and filled notebook after notebook with vocabulary and grammar notes. The breakthrough came after 8 months. Margaret was at the grocery store when she overheard 2 women speaking Spanish, complaining about the long checkout lines. Without thinking, she responded in Spanish, agreeing and making a small joke about the situation. The women's faces lit up with surprise and delight. "¿Usted habla español?" one asked. "Un poco," Margaret replied modestly, but inside, her heart was soaring. She had held a real conversation in Spanish with native speakers. That night, she called Henri, who had become her unofficial mentor and closest friend. "I did it," she whispered into the phone. "I actually communicated with people today." "Magnifique!" Henri's joy was infectious. "Now you know the secret. Language isn't just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about connection. You've just opened a door to millions of new potential friends." Emboldened by this success, Margaret made a decision that shocked her family. She enrolled in a community college Spanish class. Linda's reaction was swift and harsh. "Mom, this is embarrassing. You're making a fool of yourself. What will people think?" But Margaret had stopped caring about what people thought. In her Spanish class, she found herself among other adult learners. A retired engineer, a grandmother planning to visit her grandchildren in Mexico, a widower who wanted to honor his late wife's heritage. For the first time in years, she felt intellectually alive. Her professor, Dr. Martinez, recognized something special in Margaret. "Señora Chen," she said after class one day, "your dedication is remarkable. Have you considered our intermediate class next semester?" "I'm 71, Margaret replied. "Isn't that too old?" Dr. Martinez smiled. "Some of my best students have been your age or older. You bring life experience, cultural perspective, and most importantly, you're not learning for grades or career advancement. You're learning for pure love of knowledge. That's the most powerful motivation there is." Margaret's success with Spanish ignited an insatiable hunger. As she approached fluency in her second language, she began French, drawn by Henri's stories and the romance of the language. Then came Italian, Portuguese, German. Each new language revealed different aspects of her personality and intelligence. In Spanish, she was warm and expressive. In French, she became elegant and philosophical. German brought out her precise, analytical side. With each language, Margaret felt herself becoming more complete, more authentically herself than she had ever been. Her daily routine evolved into a carefully orchestrated symphony of learning. She would begin each morning with Spanish news, practice French pronunciation during her park walks, listen to Italian opera while cooking, and end each day with German literature. Her notebooks multiplied, filled with conjugations, cultural notes, and her own observations about the relationships between languages. The family's reaction remained skeptical at best, hostile at worst. David, visiting for a holiday dinner, found her reading Cervantes in the original Spanish. "Mom, why don't you read books in English? There are plenty of good stories you could understand." "I understand this perfectly well," Margaret replied, not looking up from her book. "But why make it harder for yourself? What's the point?" Margaret finally met her son's eyes. "The point is that I can. The point is that my mind is still growing, still learning, still capable of things you never imagined." David exchanged a look with Linda, the kind of look reserved for dealing with a delusional relative. But Margaret no longer cared about their looks, their whispers, their condescension. She had discovered something far more valuable than their approval. She had found herself again. By her third year of language learning, Margaret had achieved conversational fluency in 6 languages. But more than linguistic ability, she had gained something immeasurable: confidence. The woman who once remained silent during family dinners now engaged library patrons in multiple languages, helped lost tourists find their way, and had become a beloved fixture in the international community of her city. Her friendship with Henri had deepened into something like family. They would meet twice weekly at the park, conversing in whatever language struck their fancy that day. Henri's own language count had reached 9, and their friendly competition pushed both of them to greater heights. "You know," Henri said one crisp morning as they shared coffee on their favorite bench, "you've become a different person since we first met." "How so?" "You carry yourself differently. You speak with authority. There's a light in your eyes that wasn't there before." Margaret considered this. It was true. She felt fundamentally changed. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space now commanded attention when she spoke. The woman who had accepted others' definitions of her intelligence now defined herself. The most profound change came in her relationship with loneliness. Robert's death had left a void that seemed impossible to fill, but her languages had introduced her to communities she never knew existed. She volunteered at the Immigrant Services Center, helping newcomers navigate bureaucratic forms and cultural confusion. She joined conversation groups, attended international festivals, and discovered that the world was full of people eager to connect across linguistic barriers. Margaret's 7th language was Mandarin, a return to her roots that felt both natural and revolutionary. She had spoken it as a child, but had let it fade as she tried to assimilate into American culture. Returning to it at 74 felt like coming home to a part of herself she had abandoned. Her 8th language, Japanese, presented the greatest challenge yet. The writing systems, the complex honorifics, the subtle cultural nuances embedded in every interaction. It pushed her mental faculties to their limits. But Margaret had learned that limits were meant to be stretched, not respected. She enrolled in a university-level Japanese course, the oldest student by decades. Her younger classmates initially treated her with a kind of polite dismissal she had grown accustomed to from her family. But as weeks passed and Margaret's dedication became apparent, she earned their respect and eventually their friendship. "Chen-san," her professor said one day, using the Japanese honorific, "your kanji calligraphy is exceptional. Have you studied brush painting?" Margaret smiled. "I studied many things as a young woman. I'm just remembering them now." The 9th language was Russian, chosen for its complexity and the personal challenge it represented. Margaret was now 75, 5 years into her linguistic journey, and she felt ready to tackle the most difficult language on her list. Russian tested every skill she had developed. The Cyrillic alphabet, the cases, the aspect pairs, the cultural context required for true understanding. It was like climbing a mountain while other climbers watched in amazement that someone her age would even attempt it. But Margaret had learned something crucial over the past 5 years. The brain doesn't age the way people think it does. With proper exercise, challenge, and nurture, it can continue growing and adapting throughout life. She had become living proof that intelligence isn't fixed, that potential doesn't expire, that transformation is possible at any age. The confrontation Margaret had unconsciously been preparing for came on her 76th birthday. Linda had organized a family dinner, a gesture meant to be loving but tinged with the same patronizing concern that had characterized their relationship for years. The family gathered around Linda's dining table, David and his wife Susan, Linda and James, their children Michael and Sarah, now college-aged. The conversation flowed around Margaret as it always had, including her peripherally, but never centrally. Michael, now a junior at Northwestern, was discussing his international relations major when he mentioned struggling with his Spanish requirement. I just don't get languages, he complained. They're so hard. I can barely remember vocabulary from one day to the next. You need to practice more consistently, Margaret said quietly. The table fell silent. Margaret's contributions to academic discussions were still treated as unwelcome interruptions. Mom, Linda said with forced patience, Michael is studying at the university level. It's a bit different from your community college classes. Margaret felt the familiar flush of dismissal, but this time, something inside her snapped. 5 years of proving herself to herself had built a foundation of confidence that no amount of family condescension could shake. ¿Qué nivel de español estudias, Miguel? Margaret asked her grandson in fluent Spanish. Michael blinked in surprise. What? ¿Qué livello di spagnolo studi? Margaret repeated the question in Italian. Grandma, I don't understand. Quel niveau d'espagnol étudiez-vous? This time in French. The family stared at her in stunned silence. Margaret continued, switching between languages with effortless grace. Welches niveau Spanish studierenzi? Какой уровень испанского ты изучаешь? Анатахадо но реберуно супейн юво меньконштеймаска. Ni suedashijema shaping de si banyayu. The silence stretched until David finally found his voice. Mom, what was that? Margaret straightened in her chair, meeting each family member's gaze with steady confidence. That was the same question in 9 languages: Spanish, Italian, French, German, Russian, Japanese, Mandarin, Portuguese, and English. I asked Michael what level of Spanish he's studying. 9 languages, Susan whispered. 9 languages that I speak fluently, Margaret confirmed. Languages I've learned over the past 5 years. While you all believed I was too simple to understand academic discussions, the family sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of Margaret's achievement sank in. This was the woman they had dismissed as intellectually limited, the woman they had spoken around rather than to, the woman they had convinced themselves was incapable of complex thought. But how? Linda's voice was barely above a whisper. Margaret's smile was gentle but firm. The same way anyone learns anything, through study, practice, dedication, and believing in my own capacity to grow. The same capacity you convinced yourselves I didn't have. David leaned forward, his lawyer's mind grappling with the evidence before him. Mom, are you saying you actually speak all those languages? Fluently? Fluently enough to have meaningful conversations, to read literature, to help immigrants at the community center navigate legal documents, to volunteer as a translator at the International Festival. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. Fluently enough to know that intelligence isn't fixed, that learning doesn't stop at 70, and that the only real limitation is the one we place on ourselves. Michael, her grandson, looked genuinely remorseful. Grandma, I had no idea. How did you? I started the week after you called me embarrassing for trying to contribute to conversations about education, Margaret said, not unkindly. I decided that if I was going to be dismissed, it wouldn't be for lack of trying. The weight of their collective dismissal seemed to settle over the family like a heavy blanket. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Mom, I'm so sorry. We had no idea you were capable of... You never meant to call me stupid, Margaret finished. But you did. You never meant to make me feel worthless. But you did. You never meant to convince me that my mind was too simple for complex thoughts. But you succeeded. The pain in her voice cut through the room like a blade. But there was something else there too. Not bitterness, but a kind of transcendent strength. The difference is, Margaret continued, I chose not to believe you. I chose to prove that your assumptions about age, about intelligence, about who I am and what I'm capable of, were wrong. In the days following that dinner, Margaret's family began to see her with completely different eyes. David started asking her about her studies, genuinely curious about her methods and motivations. Linda began inviting her mother's input on decisions, finally recognizing that wisdom and intelligence had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. Michael, perhaps most changed by the revelation, began studying with his grandmother. Her patient guidance and unique teaching methods, honed through years of self-directed learning, helped him achieve fluency in Spanish within a semester. "How did you do it, Grandma?" he asked one afternoon as they practiced conversation. "How did you learn so much so fast?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think it was because I had something to prove, not to you or your parents, but to myself. When you learn for external validation, you're limited by others' expectations. When you learn for yourself, the only limit is your own imagination." But the most profound change was in Margaret herself. The woman who had once shrunk from intellectual challenges now embraced them with the enthusiasm of a child. She had enrolled in university courses, not for credit, but for pure joy of learning. She had started a blog documenting her language learning journey, inspiring hundreds of other seniors to pursue their own educational goals. Her friendship with Henri had evolved into a beautiful partnership of mutual encouragement. Together, they had started a language exchange program for elderly learners, creating a community where age was seen as an asset rather than a limitation. Margaret's story began to spread beyond her immediate circle. The local newspaper wrote a feature about her journey, which was picked up by national media. Soon, she was receiving emails from seniors around the world who had been inspired by her example to pursue their own delayed dreams. A woman from Ohio wrote, "I'm 68 and always wanted to learn French. Your story gave me the courage to start." A man from Australia shared, "I thought my learning days were over after I retired. You've shown me they're just beginning." Margaret answered every email personally, in whatever language seemed appropriate. She had become not just a polyglot, but an accidental advocate for the limitless potential of the aging mind. Universities began inviting her to speak about adult learning. Her talks were standing-room-only affairs, where she would demonstrate her linguistic abilities while sharing the deeper message that society's assumptions about aging and intelligence are not just wrong, but harmful. "I wasted 50 years believing I wasn't smart enough," she would tell audiences. "Don't waste another day accepting limitations that exist only in your mind." As Margaret reflected on her journey, she realized that learning 9 languages had been about much more than linguistic achievement. Each language had been a key that unlocked a different aspect of her personality, a different way of seeing the world. Spanish had reconnected her with warmth and expressiveness. French had awakened her philosophical nature. German had revealed her capacity for precision and analysis. Italian had unleashed her artistic sensibilities. Portuguese had connected her with a community of Brazilian immigrants who had become like family. Mandarin had healed the rift with her cultural heritage. Japanese had taught her patience and respect. Russian had shown her the beauty of complexity. And through it all, English had evolved from a source of shame to a tool of empowerment. But perhaps most importantly, the journey had taught her that the story of who we are is never finished. At 76, Margaret felt like she was just beginning to discover her true self. Margaret's children had learned something profound from their mother's transformation. They began to question their own assumptions about aging, about intelligence, about the fixed nature of human potential. David enrolled in art classes, something he had always wanted to try but dismissed as impractical. Linda started learning photography, discovering a creative side she never knew existed. The grandchildren, Michael and Sarah, became Margaret's biggest champions. They would bring friends to meet their polyglot grandmother, proudly showing off her abilities while learning valuable lessons about perseverance and the importance of never giving up on yourself. But Margaret's greatest legacy wasn't her linguistic abilities or the recognition she received. It was the simple but revolutionary idea that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Henri, now 83 and speaking 11 languages, remained her closest friend and greatest supporter. Together they had created something beautiful, a living example of the fact that age brings not limitation, but liberation from the expectations of others. You know, Henri said one morning as they sat on their favorite bench, conversing in Russian while watching the ducks, when I first met you, you were invisible to yourself. Now you're impossible to ignore. Margaret smiled, understanding the compliment in both languages and from the heart. I think I was always there, she said. I just needed permission to appear. Today, Margaret Chen is 78 years old and working on her 10th language, Arabic, because she says it's time to challenge herself with a new alphabet. She volunteers at 3 community centers, mentors dozens of adult learners, and has written a book about late life learning that will be published in, of course, multiple languages. Her family now comes to her for advice, treating her opinions with the respect they should have shown from the beginning. But Margaret harbors no resentment. She understands that their assumptions about her were really assumptions about aging that our entire society shares. The cruelest lie we tell ourselves, Margaret often says in her speeches, is that our best years are behind us. The truth is, your best years are the ones where you're still growing, still learning, still becoming, and that can be today, tomorrow, or 20 years from now. The choice is yours. Margaret's story isn't just about learning languages. It's about refusing to accept others' definitions of your limitations. It's about understanding that intelligence isn't fixed, that potential doesn't expire, and that the most beautiful chapters of your life might be the ones you haven't written yet. In a world that too often discards the elderly as irrelevant, Margaret Chen stands as living proof that age brings not diminishment, but the freedom to finally, fully become yourself. She learned 9 languages, not just to prove her children wrong, but to prove to herself that she was right all along. She was never simple, never stupid, never done growing. She was just getting started,